everyone! Welcome to the first of 4 podcast episodes where we're going to go into a deep dive of the story, the processes, and the YouTube video series for Another Apple Sleep Experiment. Today, I am talking about the story itself. I am Magpie Pony, Magpie for short, and I'm the author of both An Apple Sleep Experiment and its sequel, Another Apple Sleep Experiment. And for this first podcast episode, it will be just me talking. Yay! And as I go into detail, you will find out why. Also, before we begin, I would like to put a little disclaimer here that there will be story spoilers mentioned here, but this is not a summary of the story, and you will be thoroughly confused if you have not read and or listened to An Apple Sleep Experiment and its sequel, Another Apple Sleep Experiment. So that being said, let's dive in. The topic of a sequel to An Apple Sleep Experiment had been brought up several times over the years. It was the most requested story on Lost's channel, and of myself. I brainstormed with Lost, and a good friend who wishes to remain anonymous, about what that sequel would be, and several different ideas popped up as potentials. A few of them included AJ breaking out of prison to wreak a Count of Monte Cristo-style revenge, AJ turning her friends against Twilight breaking AJ out of prison herself to rehabilitate her, only to have AJ relapse, Big Mac avenging AJ, and many, many more. But none of those really resonated with me, to be honest. It just didn't feel right. They weren't the story I wanted to tell. So I went back to the original story and I did some research. Let's turn back the clock a little bit and talk about the first story, An Apple Sleep Experiment. People have asked me what my inspiration was and why I wrote it, and those both have the same answer. It's technically a love letter to my now wife, Lost. When I first met and got to know her, I was crushing pretty fast. And I realized her passions with YouTube lied mostly with grimdarks, which are horror-based My Little Pony Friendship is Magic content. One of her favorite characters is Applejack, and we spoke at length about how she didn't think there was a good, definitive story for Applejack in the grimdark world. I took that as a challenge. And as an expression of my growing admiration, I wrote An Apple Sleep Experiment. Now, many of you already know or are at least aware that there's an existing creepypasta called The Russian Sleep Experiment, and it will come as no surprise that it's my favorite creepypasta of all time. And it has been for, I want to say, 13 plus years now, long before I was Magpie Pony or met Lost. While the premise of that creepypasta is definitely the inspiration for the fanfiction, I wouldn't say it follows the same storyline at all. I mostly just took the concept of what would happen if a person, or a pony, was chemically kept awake for a long period of time, and the mental and physical degradation that it causes. I also referenced the final subject's speech from the original creepypasta, and I incorporated parts of it into Applejack's final speech, as a nod to the creepypasta as well. So many people have asked me why I chose that story for inspiration for Applejack, and to put it simply, I just couldn't see a scenario where Applejack could be a villain unless she was just not in her right mind. Applejack is a staple of goodness in Friendship is Magic. She's honest, but she's also compassionate and brave and always willing to help others, even to her own detriment. It was difficult for me to see how some pony like that could be twisted to evil, convincingly anyway. But we've seen AJ reach levels of desperation before in the show, and if she were motivated by familial problems, I could definitely see her making poor decisions to try and help. Before I wrote the sequel, I went back to the first one and read comments on the written story and the production on Lost's channel. I wanted to see what people liked and what they didn't like before getting started. I was mostly looking for criticisms that I could potentially address or fix in the sequel, and 2 of the biggest complaints were Twilight's characterization in the end and the absence of Discord. Discord is portrayed in Friendship is Magic as an all-powerful god of chaos. It's difficult to rein in a god when writing grimdarks. So to put it simply, grimdarks can't really convincingly exist if Discord is around. Even the show staff struggled with this Mary Sue-esque character they created. There's a reason he isn't in the movie, except a cameo in the credits. He could probably have neutralized Tempest from the get-go, and probably the Storm King by extension, so no more need for a movie. I'm not saying he's a bad character. I rather enjoy him in the episodes that he was in, but he's very troublesome to deal with in fanfictions. So for the purpose of Apple Sleep, one of two things are canon to my story. Either he doesn't exist at all in this version of Equestria, or he remained trapped in stone after the Season 2 opener. The other criticism, Twilight's characterization, was the one most often pointed out and disliked. Apple Sleep is a story about madness caused by magic, so the true villain of the story is left sort of ambiguous until the very end. I've seen countless arguments back and forth about who should be blamed. Filthy Rich for demanding more product than the Apple family could give and still survive. Applejack for taking the sleepless potion without heeding Twilight's initial warnings. Or Twilight for giving her a potion that was untested despite her initial reservations. To be honest, biggest villain of this story, in my opinion, was the drought Equestria was facing in the first story, so nature is the bad guy, yay! In the final scene, however, Twilight is visiting a now cured Applejack, and she gaslights her into thinking there was no potion, and it was a heat stroke that caused her mental break. Nature's the scapegoat this time. She mentions Starlight will take over as the element of honesty, and ultimately she's gonna hide the truth of her involvement to maintain her status as Princess of Friendship. There were a number of people upset about her characterization here, saying she'd never throw AJ under the bus. I disagree, which is why I expanded upon it in the sequel. You see, Twilight knows she has blame here, but she's looking at the bigger picture. If she were discovered to be the cause for this magic that ended up taking many pony lives, it would diminish friendship altogether, rendering her work in helping other ponies and creatures as either useless or untrustworthy. It's not that she doesn't take the blame internally, she just doesn't want her mistake to taint what she stands for, if that makes sense. In a way, Twilight will never be the same, and feels like an imposter sitting upon her throne just to maintain an image. It's why she's stalled as a character in the sequel, stuck in the state AJ left her in and unable to make more headway for the sake of friendship. Her punishment is her own self-loathing, and AJ's was her imprisonment. And Filthy Rich's is his death by AJ's hooves, but I digress. Twilight also looks up to Celestia a great deal, and Celestia is a deeply flawed character herself. She banished her own sister and let ponies practically demonize Luna for hundreds of years. She took no blame for Luna's transformation into Nightmare Moon. I mean, come on, there's a whole holiday inspired by being afraid of the big bad Nightmare Moon because she's gonna gobble up children. You were just cool with that, Celestia? So, she too swept her failures under the rug, so to speak. Twilight's just mimicking her teacher here. Plus, in my opinion, there is no precedence established in the show when it comes to dealing with horrific murders, and for good reason. This is supposed to be a show for kids, so of course, murder's never a topic discussed. So, I don't think being out of character really matters, as I know I would be a completely different person if I was faced with something this awful. You're pushed beyond your limits, and that can easily lead to horrible decision-making because you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Now let's get into the actual sequel. And there's more to the writing process than just the actual words on the screen. There were a lot of issues in the real world that heavily affected the creation of this story. Lost had once expressed to me that she would gladly host the sequel on her channel, if I were to ever write it, but asked me to keep it under 10,000 words. That's roughly the amount of words as the original story. And I'll be completely honest, she'd given me those parameters years before I actually wrote the story, so I completely forgot about the word cap. I remember in 2023, Lost was taking care of her grandmother and I was home working, and I wanted to surprise her by starting to write the sequel. I was super hyped for her to read my first draft of what would ultimately become part 1 because I was confident that I knew what story I wanted to tell. But when she learned that it was over 5,000 words and barely a fourth of the way into the story, she felt extremely overwhelmed and upset. I have been given permission by her to sort of touch on why. Back in 2022, Lost suffered a massive breakdown. It was the culmination of a lot of stress IRL, as well as some really terrible family issues, including health problems. Spending most of her time trying to pick up other people's pieces took a very big toll on her physically and mentally. That's why there was no Halloween special for 2022. I've said it before to our friends, and I'll say it again. Ponies should take a backseat to real life 100% of the time. That's not to say, though, that she didn't miss working on stories and creating audio productions. That word cap was a boundary she tried to set to make sure that she didn't overwork herself, as she has done on so many occasions in the past. It was a very tumultuous moment for Lost and myself. I hadn't intended on overwhelming her, especially after the year she'd just had, and she felt bad for trying to put a cap on my creativity. The story I wanted to tell was too complex and too important to me to try and fit into that 10,000 word limit. So the sequel was shelved for a little bit until we could both come to a compromise. Eventually, it was agreed that I could write however much I wanted, so long as I didn't hold her to the expectation that it had to take up all of the Halloween season, and it can be divided into several parts. To be frank, we still rushed the parts coming out in succession after we posted the first one, but neither of us know how to turn off, so to speak. The story itself ended up being 31,000 words, and Lost and I put so much time, love, and dedication into our grimdark productions that I think, despite the agreement we came to, Lost still felt justifiably overwhelmed. Usually I can brainstorm and edit my writing drafts with her help, but she just didn't have the mental capacity to tackle something so massive. That was difficult for me because I know my writing benefits from editors. Any writing does. And Lost is an exceptional editor. She has great insight into making my stories even stronger. So it was very hard to have to tackle this and edit it on my own. Our mutual friend was also a great editor of my work in the past, but they were kind of MIA for the writing process, so I didn't have editors. That's why I'm the only one talking in this first part of the podcast, because I was alone. It's not necessarily a bad thing in the end, because I had to really, really dig deep to bring this story together. And I was alone in the writing process for the first one too, so I just had to hope I was good enough to pull this off. This story turned from a sequel to a grimdark I once wrote into a deeply personal exploration and a written version of my innermost traumas, pains, and sorrows. The characters I wrote were unintentionally a reflection of different parts of myself, and I think utilizing my own pain really helped flesh out the characters and the characterization of the ponies. Was it worth it? Mostly yes. The reception the sequel has received has been overwhelmingly positive. Of course, there's a handful of people who dislike it. You can't please everyone. But I don't think I would want to write anything that's internally conflicting and painful like this, at least for a while. Examples? I'm sure you're wanting some. I don't want to get into too much nitty-gritty detail, but I will say I resonated with each of the main six, and especially with the story's villain. You see, I'm a very protective person for those I love. I can usually let other people's opinions and attacks to myself just slide like water off a duck's back. But if someone I care about is harmed in any way, physical or verbal or mental, I'm like a rabid dog ready to attack. The problem is that mentality is deeply, deeply flawed. In most situations in life, the best thing to do is comfort the loved one and leave the attacking party alone. But I see the pain it causes, and I just want to lash out. I want to protect my loved one, but sometimes that can create more problems than if I just let it be. That is why the villain in this story is the way that she is. The quote that resonates the most with me from her speech was, "Revenge stirs around inside you like an angry critter, biting and clawing to get out." So many horrible, horrible people in this world have caused my loved ones, especially my wife, such harm. It is one of the hardest things to leave it alone because you just have to see and marinate in their suffering, and that's the worst feeling in the world. But I know deep down, no matter how shitty it feels to just leave it alone, it's even shittier to try and attack and end up making things worse. You know that saying, the path to hell is paved with good intentions? It's very true. That's why the villain in the story doesn't have a happy ending. Even after achieving everything she'd set out to do, the hurt still existed, unchanged. But now, Equestria is left incredibly vulnerable because of what she'd done. I needed to show myself how inaction can sometimes be the best action. The internal struggles of the main five were also written as reflections of how I've felt in the past, and still sometimes in the present. When you look back at something horrible that's happened to you, you can easily internalize it. I've done what they've done. I've rationalized things away. I've twisted the narrative in my own head to make the situation more bearable. And I have a proclivity of forgetting important details of traumatic events. Not on purpose, mind you. My brain just loses details of things to protect me. And some things that started out as little problems have grown into giant monsters that seem impossible to overcome. Unlike the main five, however, I am in therapy, which helps a great deal. The main five harbor so much guilt and shame that they let it define parts of who they are. Sometimes that internalized pain can manifest externally by lashing out. The ponies in the story lash out in a physically violent way, but that is not true to how it affects me. I just want to make that clear. It was kind of cathartic to write ponies that were able to lash out like that because it's something I will never, ever do. So in a way, it was like I was able to experience that kind of aggression, but safely through art. I don't really want to go into any more detail about all of this internalization. I thought it was important to talk about how sometimes a good story comes from truth in yourself that you don't want to face. Let's switch to a lighter subject now, shall we? I wanted to talk about some of the elements that I liked about the sequel's writing process. First of all, I finally figured out Applejack's victims from the first story. It's not actually written in the written word, but I thought I would treat you all with that coveted list of names. We all know that Lyra and Bon Bon were killed, but also Cheerilee, Hondo Flanks, Filthy Rich, Blossomforth, Thunderlane, Roseluck, Aloe, Aunt Lofty, Bulk Biceps, Dr. Hooves, and Pokey Pierce. I also had to do a lot more research externally for this story, which ended up being a lot of fun. I didn't know prior to writing this that baking flour is combustible. And because flour is everywhere in a bakery and often lingers in the air when it's disturbed, that can lead to a fiery disaster. Another thing I did was research heavily into the different kind of booby traps that exist in the world. And a lot of the traps in the story are referenced from the Vietnam War. People are horrifically creative when it comes to causing other people harm. And as I researched more, I realized just how much these ingeniously deadly traps influence modern media depictions of horror. I also brushed up on actual medically researched effects of lack of sleep. And I gotta say, it's pretty damn close to the fiction both myself and the unknown author of the Russian sleep experiment have written. Of course, in my story, the effects show up much quicker because of the aspect of magic, but that's not something I would recommend looking into. No sleep equals bad. Which is funny because I lost a lot of sleep trying to write this and then put the project together. So, do as I say and not as I do. The overall goal of the sequel was to allow the audience to experience the horror that Applejack had to experience in the original fanfiction. One of the most praised and beloved scenes of the original is the hospital scene, where we caught a glimpse of AJ's fractured mind. It was that aspect that finally presented itself as the perfect way to continue the story. We've already seen the outside perspective of the carnage. Now I want the readers to mire themselves in the degradation of the mind. That's why the story is told out of order. It's also why depictions of ponies, places, and events differ from pony to pony. In the written word, I didn't want the reader to catch on to this until later in the story by slowly collecting context clues. I also utilized skewed facts to keep the reader guessing, such as a rainstorm in both Rarity and Rainbow Dash's stories. The storm itself tied the two together to make it seem like it was happening on the same night, but in reality, it was two completely different nights. There are clues in the story to cast doubt, though, if you're really looking. But since you're here, I'll just spoil it for you. In Rainbow's part, the narrative explains that the weather factory hasn't worked right since the drought, and often the weather workers can't control exact times for rain to occur like they used to. So it ties back to the original story with some in-world consequences, damn you, nature, while also creating a viable reason why two storms could exist in the same week. There are a lot of subtle details like this in the story sprinkled throughout each of the parts, but I don't want to sit here and spoil them all for you. I would say that if you're curious, go back and reread the story with a critical eye. I love stories that can be entirely different experiences each time you read them. As you continue in the story, however, the hints that things aren't as they seem become more and more obvious. Dash's part in particular sets the stage the most for something about this isn't adding up. In my opinion, this is why the written story is completely different from the production. Lost and I'll go into more details about that in a different part of the podcast. Interpreting the work for visual and audio consumption sort of takes away from the nuance, but it's still a good way to consume the media regardless. In other words, you're more likely to catch on that something's amiss if you watch the YouTube production more than if you were just to read it for yourself. I like that about the written version. It stands on its own, but it can also translate to other media and be taken totally differently. One of the major differences from the written word to the production is the very ending of the story. Lost interpreted the ending her way, while my written work leaves it much more open-ended. This doesn't mean Lost's ending isn't canon, it's just her interpretation of the story. I want people to explore the lore of the world and the characters and come to their own conclusions. I want you to reflect on the villain's actions. Try to riddle out the consequences. One of my favorite things about stories, reading and writing them, is feeling both satisfied and unsatisfied with the story's conclusion. I want most of the ideas and questions to be answered and wrapped up, but I also want the reader to reflect on whatever wasn't wrapped up, because then the story impacts you differently than anyone else. It creates a bond where you get to fill in the blanks. And I love encouraging imagination. And with that, this concludes the podcast episode of the writing process for another Apple Sleep experiment. As this podcast series continues, there will be many more secrets revealed, so to speak, as visual and audio representation gives the audience even more clues and secrets about the story as a whole. That being said, the fourth part of this podcast will include a Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, please ask in the comment section below, and your question may be answered. But please be respectful and as concise as possible. It's difficult to answer questions if there are a barrage of them in one comment, so limit your curiosity to just one question at a time, okay? Thank you so much for listening, and I cannot wait for the next parts of this podcast. Bye!